In July 2021, Vladimir Putin published an essay called On the Historical Unity of Russians and Ukrainians. This essay set out to explain his thought processes on historical ties that bind both Ukraine and Russia together, and has been used to help build their casus belli in the lead up to the conflict. I'm going to provide a critical analysis of Putin's essay and examine the Russian viewpoint in depth, particularly with regards to Ukraine. I'll explore how it attempts to rewrite history and shape public perception of the ongoing conflict in Ukraine, and what this means for the people of Ukraine and their relationship with Russia. Join me as we dive into this complex and controversial topic, exploring the historical, political, and cultural factors that have shaped the relationship between Russia and Ukraine, and the implications of Putin's essay for the region and the world at large. This is going to be one of the longest edited pieces I've ever done in this way, so please do let me know what you think, and whether you'd be interested in seeing more. It is going to take several different parts because this is long. I'll make sure to link any sources that I use in the YouTube description, and definitely encourage you to do your own research.
During the recent Direct Line, when I was asked about Russian-Ukrainian relations, I said that Russians and Ukrainians were one people, a single whole. These words were not driven by some short-term considerations or prompted by the current political context. It is what I've said on numerous occasions and what I firmly believe. I therefore feel it necessary to explain my position in detail and share my assessments of today's situation.
It's important to note that the idea of the unity of the Russians and Ukrainians is a matter of ongoing debate and controversy. While some may see these two groups as closely related, others argue that they are distinct and separate peoples with their own unique histories and cultures. The complexities of the relationship between Russia and Ukraine are shaped by a variety of factors, including historical, political, cultural differences, and it's important to consider a range of perspectives when you're examining it. This definitely isn't a new idea to Putin. He's sought to rekindle these ties between the former Soviet nations after taking power in the early 2000s. What has changed is the lengths that he's willing to go to enforce it. And we're seeing that in the body counts, in the slow destruction of the Russian economy, and in the severing of their ties to nations throughout the world.
First of all, I would like to emphasise that the war that has emerged in recent years between Russia and Ukraine, between the parts of what is essentially the same historical and spiritual space, to my mind is our great common misfortune and tragedy. These are, first and foremost, the consequences of our own mistakes made at different periods of time. But these are also the result of deliberate efforts by those forces that have always sought to undermine our unity. The formula they apply has been known from time immemorial: divide and rule. There is nothing new here. Hence the attempts to play on the national question and sow discord among people. The overarching goal being to divide and then to pit the parts of a single people against one another.
The idea of a great common misfortune and tragedy is not universally accepted, particularly among Ukrainians who have experienced a range of challenges and difficulties in their relationship with Russia over the years. Many Ukrainians see the ongoing conflict as a result of Russian aggression and interference in their country's affairs, rather than simply the result of historical mistakes or external forces seeking to divide and rule. Russia's actions are just as much a desire to maintain influence in the region and assert dominance over its neighbours as it is about restoring the brotherhood between two peoples. There's a great report from the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace that was published in 2020 titled Russia and Ukraine, A Long and Difficult Relationship, which gives a great look into the common history between the two. It definitely hasn't been all sunshine and rainbows. We need look no further than the Holodomor, a man-made famine that took place in Soviet Ukraine from 1932 to 1933. The famine was caused by a combination of forced collectivization policies and the seizure of grain by the Soviet government, which left millions of people without access to food. Estimates of the number of deaths vary widely, but some scholars suggest that as many as 3.9 million people may have died as a result of the famine. The Holodomor was widely recognized as an act of genocide against the Ukrainian people, and it remains a deeply traumatic and contentious issue in Ukrainian history and politics. The UN actually recognized it as an act of genocide in 2003 against the Ukrainian people.
To have a better understanding of the present and look into the future, we need to turn to history. Certainly, it is impossible to cover in this article all the developments that have taken place over more than 1,000 years, but I will focus on the key, pivotal moments that are important for us to remember, both in Russia and Ukraine. Russians, Ukrainians, and Belarusians are all descendants of Ancient Rus, which was the largest state in Europe. Slavic and other tribes across the vast territory from Ladoga, Novgorod, and Pskov to Kiev and Chernigov were bound together by one language, which we now refer to as Old Russian. Economic ties, the rule of the princes of the Rurik dynasty, and, after the baptism of Rus, the Orthodox faith. The spiritual choice made by Saint Vladimir, who was both Prince of Novgorod and Grand Prince of Kiev, still largely determines our affinity today.
While it's true that Russians, Ukrainians and Belarusians share a common historical and cultural heritage, it's important to recognise that the relationship is complex and multifaceted. The idea that these groups are all descendants of Ancient Rus is contested, and there are many who argue that Ukraine and Belarus have their own distinct histories and cultures that can't be simply subsumed into a larger Russian identity. Ancient Rus was a medieval state that emerged in what is now Russia, Ukraine and Belarus in the 9th century. At its height, it was the largest state in Europe, which stretched from the Baltic Sea to the Black Sea. The people of Ancient Rus were united by a common language, Old Russian, as he says, as well as by economic ties, their political institutions and the Orthodox Christian faith. So he's right on that. The state was ruled by a succession of princes from the Rurik dynasty. They were based in Novgorod and later Kiev, which led to its popular naming the Kievan Rus. So technically Ukraine would be the parent country in this situation. Additionally, the role of the Orthodox faith in binding these groups together is a subject of ongoing debate and controversy. While some may view the shared religious tradition as a unifying force, others argue that the Russian Orthodox Church has been used as a tool of political and cultural domination, particularly in the context of the Soviet Union and its aftermath. Overall, while there are certainly shared historical and cultural ties between Russians, Ukrainians and Belarusians, it's important to recognise the diverse perspectives and experiences of these groups and avoid oversimplifying that relationship.
The throne of Kiev held a dominant position in Ancient Rus. This had been the custom since the late 9th century. The Tale of Bygone Years captured for posterity the words of Oleg the Prophet about Kiev. Let it be the mother of all Russian cities. Later, like other European states of that time, Ancient Rus faced a decline of central rule and fragmentation. At the same time, both the nobility and the common people perceived Rus as a common territory, as their homeland. The fragmentation intensified after Batu Khan's devastating invasion, which ravaged many cities, including Kiev. The northeastern part of Rus fell under the control of the Golden Horde, but retained limited sovereignty. The southern and western Russian lands largely became part of the Grand Duchy of Lithuania, which, most significantly, was referred to in historical records as the Grand Duchy of Lithuania in Russia.
Yeah, here we start to get into the first proper part of historical revisionism. This passage contains a mixture of factual information and historical interpretations, and some of them may be subject to debate or disagreement among scholars and historians, and I count myself in that. So here's a few points to consider. That the throne of Kiev held a dominant position in Ancient Rus is generally accurate. Kiev was the capital of the Kievan Rus in the 9th century, and it did play an important role in the development of Slavic culture and identity. The quote that was attributed to Oleg the Prophet in the Tale of Bygone Years is, again, accurate and reflects the importance of Kiev as that cultural and political centre in Ancient Rus before the decline in their power. That began in the 12th century. They began to break up into smaller principalities. They competed for power and resources. To say that both the nobility and common people perceived the Rus as a common territory is somewhat subjective and sort of difficult to verify given the low levels of literacy in the area. While it's true that there was a sense of shared cultural identity among the Eastern Slavic peoples, the degree to which this translated into a sense of shared national identity is definitely a matter of debate. With the breakup, it's far more likely that people felt more of an affiliation to their city or their ruler or their particular region than to some vague concept of Russia. Other than that, the rest is largely accurate. The principalities did fall under the control of the Mongols of the Golden Horde. They had a tributary relationship with a high degree of autonomy. And under their rule, the princes of Muscovy, which would become Moscow or Moskva, became the main tax collectors for the region under the Mongols. And as you can imagine, that did give them a huge degree of power and wealth in the region, and is arguably the reason that they are the capital now, rather than what at the time were the larger cities like Novgorod. The statement that the southern and western Russian lands became part of the Grand Duchy of Lithuania is wildly inaccurate in a modern context, and passable, I suppose, in a historical context. The Grand Duchy of Lithuania was a powerful state that emerged in the 13th century and eventually encompassed most of modern-day Belarus, as well as Ukraine and Lithuania. These lands would eventually be part of Russia, but only in the context of the Russian Empire and the Soviet Union. The people that lived there were definitely Eastern Slavs, but not necessarily Russian. The claim that the Grand Duchy was referred to in historical records as the Grand Duchy of Lithuania and Russia is a bold one, and I honestly can't find any sources that say this. If there are any, please send them to me. I would assume that they are in Russian, and if they do exist, it's most likely a piece of historical revisionism to try and emphasize the role of Russia within the Grand Duchy.
Members of the princely and boyar clans would change service from one prince to another, feuding with each other but also making friendships and alliances. Vovod Bobrok of Volyn and the sons of Grand Duke of Lithuania Algirdas, Andrei of Polotsk and Dmitry of Bryansk fought next to the Grand Duke Dmitry Ivanovich of Moscow on the Kulikovo field. At the same time, Grand Duke of Lithuania Jogaila, son of the princes of Tver, led his troops to join with Mamai. These are all pages of our shared history, reflecting its complex and multidimensional nature. Most importantly, people both in Western and Russian lands spoke the same language. Their faith was Orthodox. Up to the middle 15th century, the unified church government remained in place.
There are some interesting points in this passage, but it contains some historical simplifications and inaccuracies. It's true that members of the princely and boyar clans in the medieval Rus often changed their allegiances and engaged in feuds, as was, quite common throughout the world. The passage's suggestion that these shifting loyalties were the primary mode of political organisation in medieval Rus is a bit of a simplification. Many Rus princes and boyars also maintained stable alliances and built long-term political networks. Putin then accurately notes that the voivode Bobrok of Volyn, I'm going to butcher all of these names and I apologise in advance, and the sons of Grand Duke Algirdas fought alongside Grand Duke Dmitry Ivanovich of Moscow at the Battle of Kulikovo in 1380. But it does leave out important context. This battle was part of a larger conflict between the Golden Horde and the various Rus principalities, and its outcome was far from decisive. Moreover, the participation of Voivod Bobrok and the sons of Algirdas in the battle does not necessarily demonstrate a shared cultural or national identity among the various princes and boyars. Donald Ostrovsky actually did a great piece on the context of this battle and its place in Russian history, which I will link in the description. The claim that Grand Duke Jogaila of Lithuania led his troops to join with Mamai at the same time of the Battle of Kulikovo is wrong. That is a fabrication. Jogaila did lead Lithuanian troops in a campaign against the Golden Horde in the early 15th century, but that was several decades after the Battle of Kulikovo. The idea that people in Western and Eastern Russian lands spoke the same language with a shared common Orthodox faith is generally accurate, but it is worth noting that there were several regional variations in language and practice, religious practice that is, as there were all over Europe and Asia at the time. the statement that a unified church government remained in place in the Rus until the middle of the 15th century is a huge simplification again. There was a single centralized Orthodox church in Rus for much of its early history. This unity began to break down in the 14th and 15th centuries. Various local churches asserted their independence, and by the mid-15th century, we had large regional churches like the churches of Novgorod, Pskov, Galicia, Volhynia, and Serbia. There were many others as well, each with its own unique traditions, practices, and political relationships. So to say that it was one overarching polity is just nonsense. That's about all I can stomach for now. Hopefully this has given you an idea of just how easy it is to warp history to suit your own narrative, especially to an audience that is unlikely to know better. We haven't even touched on his descriptions of the Soviet years, of the time together in the Russian Empire, or the periods after the various collapses. I'd love to come back and revisit this, do a part 2, 3, 4 further. I mean, this essay is massive. So if it's the sort of thing that you found interesting and you want to motivate me to continue, please do like, subscribe, share, comment, whatever you want to do to help me with the algorithm. It's all massively appreciated. So thank you, and I'll catch you next time.